Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Russell Guay. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Management and David W. Wilson Chair in Business Ethics. Welcome to the Faculty and Staff Ethics Interview Series. Joined today by Dr. Craig Van Sandt. Craig is in his 9th year at UNI. He's also an associate professor in the Department of Management. He's a past Wilson Chair as well, so it's great to have him on here today. Before UNI, he had spent 13 years at Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois. Had worked for several years in accounting and real estate before returning to academia. And as far as Craig's academic background, bachelor's was in business and accounting at TCU, Texas Christian University, MBA in finance from North Carolina, and PhD in management and ethics from Virginia Tech. Craig, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
I always enjoy getting to talk about ethics and hopefully can, help some people think about it.
Exactly. So you had sent me some notes yesterday, and I think what we're going to talk about is kind of a distribution look at the abundance of natural resources that are out there rather than a scarcity take that some people would go down on this particular path. So I'll have some questions obviously for you as we go through, but I'll kind of let you get started on what you might want to talk about here, and I'll be jumping back in.
Sure. Well, I've been studying ethics now, I guess, for over a quarter of a century.
Okay.
And recently looked at an article that appeared in the Harvard Business Review back in 1993, 28 years ago.
Yeah.
And it was titled, "What's the Matter with Business Ethics?" And, I thought it'd be kind of interesting to look at that after almost 30 years in the field. And the author of that, a guy named Andrew Stark, basically was making the argument that business ethics as an academic field was too academic. It wasn't addressing the problems that practicing managers had. And he subdivided those problems into two areas. The first was, as you can imagine, identifying what the right thing to do is in a particular case.
Which is not always the easiest thing to determine either.
Well, no, it isn't. And I would argue, though, that he is misguided in that question, in that even with the best ethical thinkers out there, the philosophers, they've disagreed on this for, literally thousands of years.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I tell my students in my business ethics class that there is no right answer to an ethical dilemma, and yet there are multiple right answers to an ethical dilemma. That's
very
just
true. It's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, it's that's just the very nature of ethics. And so I think to criticize business ethics on that grounds is misguided.
Sure.
His second issue, though, I think is very relevant today and something that business ethics needs to be addressing. And that is, his contention is that even when it is pretty clear what the right thing to do is, that business ethics doesn't help managers follow that course in the face of competing pressures and institutional pressures. As we all know, the saying is, the business of business is business.
Sure.
And, what that means for the most part is make money.
Right.
And so, his complaint being that when doing the right thing might be perceived as unprofitable, then the ethicists don't tell managers how to deal with that competing pressure. And that gets to the problem that I'm wanting to talk about today, which is, and this in some ways gets pretty deep pretty quickly, but my contention is that we are still trying to solve the problems that have faced humans since the beginning of humankind.
Sure.
And that is a problem of scarcity and survival. How do we go about getting enough resources to eat, to clothe ourselves, to shelter ourselves, just so that we can live to see tomorrow? As we look back to the Stone Age and the hunter-gatherers and all of that, that's what their life consisted of, was
Absolutely.
trying to get enough to survive. If we look at the world where we are today, we still see literally billions of people facing that problem. But what is less known is that from a resource standpoint, from a technological standpoint, everything I read says that we produce enough food, enough clothing, that we can literally house, feed, and clothe the entire population of the world. And in fact, there's a guy at Penn State, I'm not familiar with him and I won't go into it, but he claims that even with today's production, we produce enough stuff to clothe and feed and shelter some 12 billion people. And last count, we were at 7.7 or 7.8 billion. So we obviously still do have a problem, okay? The fact that we've got billions of people who are starving,
absolutely,
indicate that we have a problem. But I want to argue that the problem is one of distribution, not one of scarcity. And that kind of gets us right into that second question that Stark said. If we have a relatively clear ethical direction, how do we go about doing that in the face of competing pressures?
Okay.
I say that because I think it's fairly clear that if I have enough to eat, but my next door neighbor is starving, it seems rational. It seems like everybody would be willing to share some food with your neighbor.
I would hope that's the case. Yeah.
It's not a hard question. So
right.
It's a gray area. But that goes in the face of everything we know,
exactly,
that we think we know about business. We're supposed to make money at business. We're not supposed to share things. And so it seems to me that today's problem is, how do we go about changing that mindset of making money with everything we do, as opposed to trying to distribute the goods that we have in a more fair fashion, a more equitable fashion, so that people can not only survive, but thrive. Now some of our more conservative viewers might be thinking, oh, geez, he's going down the communist path here. I guess in some ways you could take this argument as that, but I don't think it really is. Capitalism has been shown to be very productive. It is why we are able to produce enough to feed and clothe everybody today. Sure. To me, it's just a matter of how do we go about making that distribution channel, distribution more fairly.
Sure.
You gave my academic background, and I want to say just a few words about that. When I went back to get my PhD, there were a number of directions that I could have gone with that, but I chose business ethics because at that point, that was the late 90s. At that point, I became convinced that business as a social institution was the most important social institution in the world,
Okay.
outranking government, outranking religion. Business is what essentially drives our lives. It provides the goods that we use, it provides the food we eat, it provides the income that most of us use
Sure.
to buy those things. And so if we're going to make any kind of major social change, to me, it's going to have to come through business. And so I figured if I wanted to be some minute part of bringing about that change, business ethics was the best way to go about doing that.
Okay.
And like I say, over the course of 25, 30 years, it has become even more apparent to me that this business model that we use, especially in the United States, of a very competitive, individualistic capitalism, is becoming more and more of a problem because, as we're seeing, the gains from all of that production are going to a smaller and smaller share of people. There's a lot of talk about wealth gaps and income gaps in our society at this point. One of the ways that I've seen this discussed, I thought was really good in a book that Alfie Kohn wrote many years ago called No Contest. He called this idea of competition mutually exclusive goal attainment. Okay. If you and I are competing and I win, that means you can't. And that seems to be the model for our economic system.
I teach negotiations, and nearly all the students come in with the mindset of, if I win, you have to lose in this negotiation. And it takes the first month of the class to break them on that and to focus on the whole win-win nature of what negotiations can be, rather than trying to crush your opponent. So yeah, you're absolutely right. But
it would be interesting to know how long that mindset lasts for them.
Well, for some of them, it never does stop the entire semester long, and it's obviously going to carry on well after that too. For some of them, I'm able to start making inroads fairly early on, but yeah, I mean, some of them have just been brought up in a competitive mindset, and I don't know that it will ever disappear, much less lessen at all. But hopefully, make some progress at least every semester.
Well, but that's essentially what I'm getting at, is that mindset. And that is an incredibly difficult thing to change. When we are brought up from the cradle with certain values and certain social norms, it's really hard to get that change. And I guess this is a good point to get people to think about how difficult the mindset change I'm talking about is.
Exactly.
From one of, we got to work extra hard just to survive, to one of, hey, there's enough production out there. There's enough stuff that we can all survive if we just figure out how to distribute it more equally.
Yeah.
To make this even more difficult, all of this is happening within the realm of climate change.
Sure.
And as we're seeing, I think more and more people are agreeing that yes, climate change is real and human caused. But we're also hearing we've only got 10 or 20 years to make these changes. And I have to put a plug in for a book right now. Can I do show and tell here?
Of course.
I'm reading a book called The Ministry for the Future.
Okay.
Stanley Robinson, is he bills himself as a speculative fiction writer.
Okay.
So this particular book is set in the 2030s, 2040s, 2050s. So just, 10, 20 years out.
At least we're still here in his book at that point. So this is progress from what we think.
We're still here, but
all right.
Climate change has gotten much, much worse, and that has become the central problem for people. And so we've got to figure out how to distribute things more equitably. And please note, I'm not saying equally.
Sure.
But we don't have much time to do that.
Right.
Things really do get bad really quickly. I want to, at this point, also refer our listeners to a guy named David Corton, who has been a foreign development official. He's taught at Harvard, written a bunch of books. He gave a talk to a group that I belong to last April, I think it was, and no, it was June of last year. He was talking to the International Humanistic Management Association. And one of the questions that came up is, what should business educators be doing to address these issues? And he had written a book back in the 1970s called The Limits to Growth.
Okay.
And as he relates in this talk, and I'm going to quote him here in a second, he was teaching a doctoral seminar at Harvard in the 70s called Management and the Future, which never heard of a seminar like that anywhere I've taught.
I would agree.
Would be an interesting one. But he says they had really great conversations. And here I'm going to quote Dr. Corton.
Okay.
He says, if we took these issues to the limits to growth seriously, how would humanity and business education have to change? Is the purpose of the Harvard Business School, and I would add business schools in general,
sure,
is it the purpose of the Harvard Business School to prepare young people for success in business as it exists? And he emphasized that, the system of business as it exists, or is it to prepare these students to transform that system? I think that is exactly the question we face here. And, he's talking.
That was 50 years ago, or almost 50 years ago, depending on which year the book came out. Yes.
Right.
Wow.
And, I think that question becomes even more compelling 50 years later.
Agree completely. Yes.
When climate change is that much closer to us. So going back to Stark's original question of, if we have a clear ethical answer, which I think we do, how do we, as business educators, help practicing managers resist those existing forces of competitiveness, the institution of business? How do we help them resist those forces to pursue the more ethical path?
Wow. Okay.
And I didn't have this in my notes, but a quote. The author's a guy named Snow, and I can't even tell you what the book is, but he's arguing in his book about big changes that need to be made, and how do we do that?
Okay.
And the last sentence of his book is essentially, I don't have the answer on how to do that. The best we can do is nag away. And I think in some sense that's true. We just nag.
Yeah, well, and even though with the answer part, it's going to take more than one thought on how to do this anyway. We've all got to come together and build the best ideas for this this answer anyway, I think, in that regard. But yeah, it's definitely a great starting point.
Yeah, and I think as we talk about this solution, for us as business educators, we need to be hammering on this future orientation issue.
Sure, sure.
We need to be talking about the ethics of business and what it is we want business to do. One of the schools of thought about how to address climate change that is gaining some value, but people are really resisting it, is something called degrowth. How do we actually shrink our economy so that it fits within our natural resources? And so in my strategy class, when I do a section on futuring in the strategy class to try and get my students thinking about the future, one of the exercises that I do is to ask them to create a strategy for business, for a particular business, in a degrowth environment. I've got to say, they're not very good at it.
Okay.
But I'm not either. And I don't think any of us are going to be good at that until we change the bigger mindset of how do we live in a world where we have enough for everybody, and yet we're also running up against the limits of our natural resources.
Right. And I'm still blown away just by the numbers you started with, that we've got enough food and resources for 12 billion people already in that are produced in things. And yeah, those numbers alone are mind-boggling too. This shouldn't be that hard to fix in some way.
And it literally is a distribution problem. I've got a good friend who lives in India. He's wealthy, so he's not, the poor that many of us think of. He sent me articles about how literally tons of grain get shipped to India, but they don't have the distribution resources. They don't have warehouses, they don't have trucks and those kinds of things. And so more often than not, these tons of grain sit out in the weather. India has a very humid climate. And it rots. These are not problems that it would take a lot to solve. We just don't have the will to do it. Or the incentives to do it.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it on here. Of course, the last couple of years, at least the 18 months of the pandemic, with all the supply chain issues, I don't know how quickly we could attack the distribution area right now, but I mean, certainly we could be working on the ways, the process behind it, so that when the supply chain is running a little more smoothly, hopefully we could then start to implement a lot of these practices.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody who talks about supply chain says it is a short-term problem.
Right. Yeah, we hope so anyway.
And we know how to ship stuff from one side of the world.
That's true.
We can do this.
Yeah.
Let me make one more plug.
Sure.
Book. I am embarrassed. This book is called Donut Economics by an English economist, Kate Raworth. I heard about this at a seminar that I went to several years ago in Vienna about alternative economic systems and how they relate to the environment. I'm embarrassed to say that this thought never occurred to me. In some ways, what Raworth is saying is we should look at the economy literally as a donut, with the inner circle being distribution of goods and services that allow people a minimum standard of living, that, not wealth, not
Sure.
like that, but
Right.
so you have enough food and
Right. Not stuck in poverty either. Enough to
right,
sustain.
right.
Yes.
And then the outer ring of her donut is the natural resources,
Okay.
that we have to keep our economic activity within that realm of what the earth can provide us. And her argument is that looking at the economy as a donut with the sweet spot outside that inner ring and inside that outer ring makes our decisions that much easier about how to produce and distribute our goods and services.
That's interesting. Yeah.
It is not, it is not a high level economics book. It's primarily interested in looking at economics in a different manner than we have. I think it's well worth the time.
Yeah, I agree. I know I was seeing some things over the last few months. I post some of these things on LinkedIn and whatnot, but lately a lot of the trends on, the old adage, the rich get richer all the time. And unfortunately, during the pandemic, that even was more so than ever before, it looks like. I know a lot of people had speculated those getting hurt most might be the business owners losing a lot there. And now it looks like that gap widened a lot more even yet during the pandemic. So
yeah, especially
more work to do.
The Silicon Valley entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
That was frightening how much they have.
I agree. I wanted to circle back because I bring this up in both leadership and negotiations. You talked about the equitable component and mentioned or italicized that you weren't talking about equal, you were talking about equitable. Give me your take on that a little bit. Like I said, I talk about them in leadership and negotiations both, and sometimes the students don't always buy into the value of looking at things from an equitable standpoint more so than equal. So I just wanted to, since you had brought both terms up, I thought I'd get your spin on that too.
Well, I'll address that by going back to a seminar that when I went to Augustana, I was told that as a condition of my employment there, that I would teach a 1-hour seminar on diversity in the workplace. I'm thinking at that point, I was a middle-aged white guy. I'm an old white guy now. But I actually said to them, what can a middle-aged white guy talk about in terms of diversity? But as I taught the course several years, I found interesting things to talk about. In the final class period of that course, we always talked about equality of opportunity versus equality of outcomes. Everybody thought equality of opportunity is a good thing. Okay. Nobody thought equality of outcomes was a good thing. The idea being that if we can all start off from the same starting point, then it's okay for some people to earn more money, for some people to not do as well, because if you're all equal from the starting point, then, if somebody's smarter, somebody works harder, somebody's talented, then yeah, we can see why their rewards should be somewhat greater.
Right.
And so that to me is the essence of equitable, that, yeah, we should differentially reward people based on their level of production, their level of contribution, whatever you want to call it.
Exactly.
And it probably would be a perverse incentive if we rewarded everybody equally. The big argument about communism is that it takes away incentive to do more. So to me, what we're trying to find is that happy medium where people are still differentially rewarded for their extra effort, their extra talent, whatever. And yet we're also willing to give people that basic level that allows them an equal start in life.
Okay.
We really don't have that
Right.
at this point.
Yeah, when I bring it up in class, so they have this mindset that equal rewards probably, so for 4-person work team, for example, equal rewards probably make the most sense. It's easy to do, whatever. Okay, well, what if somebody's not doing as much of the workload? Well, that's okay. Give them an equal share. All right. What if you, for whatever reason, had to do 70% of the workload on this project? You're still going to split it equally. And then all of a sudden the light bulb goes off. Oh, no, that's not fair anymore. I need a bigger share of it. And I need to take it to that perspective to get them to see the difference between some of these types on here. It's always an odd dynamic in there. One of the other areas I wanted to circle back to, I know you said it was the late 90s, I think, when you started your PhD program and chose the ethics route. As far as the students going into the business world today versus those 25 years ago or so when you started your PhD, do you think there's higher ethical expectations of them in the business world today than there would have been 20 years ago, 25 years ago?
Yes, I think there is. And
Right.
I say that as an avowed pessimist. I often tell people that, the old thing of, is this glass half full or half empty? My answer is always it's half empty and it's leaking.
Okay.
So it's important to know that, because I do think ethics is much more front and center in the business world today.
Good.
We are, for whatever reason, I'd like to think it's all because I've been telling my students that business ethics is important.
Absolutely.
But, we know it's not that. But people expect more from business now. I do believe that.
That's good to hear. Yeah, I wasn't sure. I mean, any day in the news, we can find scandals in everything, not just the business world, but
Sure.
academia, politics, religion, sports, whatever we're talking about. So yeah, but then again, I mean, the news is just so much more readily available now in social media now than it was 20 or 25 years ago too, that it's sometimes hard to know if there's more corruption, more scandals today, or if we just know about everything instantaneously now versus back
Right.
then.
Yeah, I fully agree with you on that. In some ways, I tell my business ethics students that I have a really low bar for what I want them to get out of the class.
Okay.
And that low bar basically is every decision a manager makes has an ethical component to it.
Sure.
Because every decision you make affects other people. And once you affect somebody else, there's an ethical issue.
Right. Right. Yeah.
What worries me, and we were joking about this before we started the video, but what worries me in a lot of areas of business and business education, it seems to me that we actively discourage our students from thinking about ethics.
Sure.
We go into a marketing class to learn how to design a marketing survey and how to collect information from our customers. We don't ever talk about the ethics of privacy issues.
Okay.
We go to a finance class and we learn how to do discounted cash flow models and internal rates of return. We don't ever talk about the effect of buying a new machine and laying off 10 workers. We don't ever talk about the ethical issues involved in that. In fact, I've challenged some of my finance students sometime to take a finance test. And when they ask you to do an internal rate of return answer,
Yep.
instead of answering with the internal rate of return, saying something, we shouldn't do this because it's unethical, because I guarantee them they'll fail that test. So,
Yeah, might miss some points on that one, even if it's the right answer there. Yeah.
well, and I don't mean to say that those other things, marketing, finance, all that,
Sure.
are unimportant. They have allowed us to create wealth to an, previously unimaginable scale.
Sure.
But if we do all those things without being in an ethical framework, then we start seeing some of the problems our society
Right.
in spades today.
Yeah. I have heard several good examples from some of our colleagues in other departments of some of the ethical things they bring into their classes. So I'm optimistic that at least there's some emphasis there, certainly not as much as in other classes, but hopefully we can get to a point where, whether it's a guest speaker or a video or a activity or something, hopefully we can get to the point where there's an ethics component in every course if we're not already there. I don't think that's too much to ask by any means.
No. And when I got started studying ethics, there was a big debate in the field of how to approach ethics education in a business school.
Okay.
On the one hand, you had the proponents of, you need standalone ethics courses that can go into these questions in depth and really explore them. The other end of the spectrum was, no, you infuse ethics throughout the curriculum. You have your finance professor talk about it. You have your marketing professor, accounting professor. That debate has kind of gone away. A lot of business schools, in fact, UNI is one of the few business schools that does not have a required ethics component.
Okay.
So a lot of schools have gone with the required standalone course. But to me, the answer was always both.
Yeah. Yeah, we're on the same page with that one.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously it makes sense, of course, for leadership students and HR students and those that are dealing with more ethical issues on a daily basis. That's the no-brainer. But yes, it goes so far beyond just that aspect. And yeah, I agree that probably the students in the management department that do take the ethics course as well are getting much more focus on some of the ethics material than the other students are, unfortunately.
No,
Oops, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, it is interesting to me, and I'm really appreciative that you were largely the driver behind the leadership major now requiring the business ethics course. Once you get put in a leadership role, or once you assume a leadership role, that's where ethics really comes into play.
And you can't then learn ethics the day you put into a leadership role. You have to know it by then, at least have some background by then. So yeah, I don't want them to not learn it until they get thrown into one of these roles. And at that point, if they don't have the ethical knowledge and background, it is too easy to cut corners sometimes and just see the short-term benefit as opposed to looking at the big picture there.
I know we're going over time here, but can I add one
Feel
other?
free. Yeah.
I think there is a misconception about ethics that the main part of ethics is knowing what the right thing to do is. I would argue that that's probably the least of it. We all, whether we are trained in philosophy or we went to Sunday school as a kid, or our parents just told us to share toys, we all have some way of deciding what's right and wrong.
Exactly.
And I think for the most part, most of us do that reasonably well.
And if you have to ask or even think much about whether it's okay to do it, you probably have your answer already.
Yeah, probably. What I have become convinced of is it's the other parts of the ethical dilemma that are more important.
Sure.
A guy named James Rest breaks down ethical behavior into 4 components: moral awareness, moral judgment, moral motivation, and moral courage.
Okay.
We all spend all of our time talking about moral judgment, which is simply, should I do this or not? It's all those other things.
Yeah.
Being aware that there might be a moral issue. To me, moral motivation is the biggest issue.
Yeah.
Rest defines that as, where do you rank doing the right thing in comparison with all those other motivations you have?
Okay.
And I would argue that where we fail as a society is mostly in that moral motivation, because we have said, getting rich, accumulating a lot of stuff, living in a nice house, all that kind of stuff is a higher motivation than doing the right thing.
Exactly.
And until we change that, I don't know that we're going to make a lot of progress.
Well, what would I do with a 30-car garage if I didn't have 30 collector cars to put in it, Craig?
That's true.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's true. Yes. Yeah, you're talking about the moral courage, and that's one of the areas that I get on in leadership too. And we'll spend early in the semester, we'll talk about managers versus leaders and look at one of the differences there. And I think it was one of Peter Drucker's quotes that managers do things right, leaders do the right thing. And there's times we'll spend an entire hour and 15-minute class period on what exactly is he talking about with these two sentences there. I mean, they look so similar, but what are we getting at here? And it's always so fascinating to hear the student perspective on what they think this means.
Can you say a little bit more about that? I'm actually a little surprised that students.
Well, they at least speculate on it there, because managers do things right, looking at, are we following laws? Are we doing the legal thing? Maybe the ethical thing, leaders doing the right thing. Are we looking at the long-term aspect? Are we looking at the vision? Are we trying to take the whole big picture into account? And so I think that's where he's going with that. But the student perspective will sometimes just have a different approach altogether from that. And I used to use this in the corporate world too, and I would do some consulting and I put this quote up. And even then there would be times we'd spend 30 minutes, 45 minutes going back and forth on, sometimes people don't think there is a difference between managers and leaders, first of all.
Right.
So we kind of have to get past that notion. And then we can dive into what exactly these two phrases are getting at. And it's just always such a unique approach to hear what the students how they might be interpreting those two things and what they think he might have been getting at with that particular quote.
Well, I think that quote also gets back to the second part that I started my conversation with start. If we know what the right thing to do is, what are all those pressures out there pushing us away from doing that?
Right. I agree completely. Yeah. Well, Craig, thank you so much for taking time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Well, I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to talk about things I've been thinking about for many years.
Yeah, I think whether it's the students or our colleagues or whoever else may be watching these, I think there's a lot of good takeaways. Hopefully people give it some thought on here and some of the perspectives we shared today.
I hope so too. Thank you for the opportunity.
You're very welcome. Thanks again.